You have stopped looking for the signals, or you are trying to. The work of genuinely returning to yourself, the real, unglamorous daily work of it, includes the gradual loosening of the hypervigilant attention that the dynamic trained you to maintain, the constant low-level monitoring of their behavior for evidence of what they actually feel, the reading of every silence and every small gesture and every unremarkable action for the meaning beneath it. You are working to let that monitoring rest, to redirect the attention toward your own life, your own interior, the actual texture of the days you are living, rather than the imagined texture of what is happening on the other side of the silence. And yet the question surfaces. What are they actually communicating in the spaces between the explicit communication they are not offering? What do the behaviors mean, the ones that do not quite fit the indifference the silence seems to argue for? Whether what you are occasionally noticing, in the peripheral vision of an attention that is trying to be elsewhere, is real. 3 signals are worth examining honestly, not as confirmation of a particular outcome, not as the foundation of a hope that has already cost enough, as accurate information about what avoidant psychology actually communicates when the explicit channels are closed and the interior is finding whatever indirect expression it can reach. The first silent signal is the maintenance of a connection that serves no obvious practical purpose. Not dramatic maintenance, not the reaching out that announces itself as reaching out. The quiet, easily deniable, practically justifiable maintenance of a thread that, looked at honestly, has no function other than the thread itself. It presents as the continued following of your public presence when unfollowing would require no effort and create no practical difficulty. As the occasional engagement with something peripheral and undeniable, not a direct message, not anything that requires response or acknowledgement, but something that registers, that is visible, that communicates, without committing to communicating, that the monitoring continues. The psychology behind this is specific. The avoidant who has genuinely processed a connection and moved past it does not maintain threads with no practical purpose. The ending of genuine indifference is clean in a way that invested detachment is not. When threads are maintained, when the connection is kept alive in its most minimal, most deniable, most practically justifiable form, the maintenance is the signal, not of readiness, not of change, but of the interior's ongoing orientation toward you, in the absence of any behavioral framework for what to do with that orientation. The thread is the avoidance nervous system refusing to complete the severance that the exterior behavior has been performing. It is the attachment system operating below the level of the managed presentation, keeping what the presentation is trying to release, holding what the architecture is trying to let go of. The practical justification for maintaining it is real. There is always a practical justification available for the avoidant who needs one. But the practical justification is not the reason. The reason is simpler and less comfortable than any justification the intellect can provide. They are not ready to let the thread go. And the not readiness, however unconscious, and however thoroughly the management system is working to keep it from becoming something that would require acknowledgement, is the signal. The second silent signal is behavioral inconsistency in contexts adjacent to you. Not the inconsistency of someone who is simply variable in their moods and engagement across all contexts. The specific inconsistency of someone whose ordinary, regulated, self-consistent behavioral presentation changes in quality when something in their environment references you. When your name appears in a shared context, when something associated with you surfaces in conversation, when the peripheral environment contains information about you that is absorbed, however briefly, into their ordinary processing. This inconsistency is subtle. It does not announce itself. It is not the dramatic, visible disruption of someone who is obviously affected. It is something more like a slight shift in register, a quality of attention that changes, a response to something unrelated that carries for a moment a different texture than the response that preceded it. The composure is intact, the presentation is maintained, but the maintenance, in that specific moment, requires slightly more effort than it was requiring before the reference appeared. People who know the avoidant well sometimes notice this without naming it. There is a quality to the avoidance engagement that changes when you are in the conversational environment, even indirectly. a quality that does not fit the indifference the behavior is otherwise performing. What is happening beneath the inconsistency is the interior responding to the stimulus before the management system has completed its interception. The emotional response fires before the regulation catches it, and in the moment between the firing and the regulation, in the brief, small, easily missed space where the interior is expressing itself before the management system redirects it, the signal is visible. Not to everyone, not consistently, but to careful attention to the specific perceptual sensitivity of someone who has intimate knowledge of this particular person's interior and exterior and the gap between them, the inconsistency is legible. It reads as the interior's involuntary acknowledgement of your continued significance in the economy of what actually matters to the avoidant, regardless of what the behavioral presentation is otherwise arguing. The third silent signal is the one that is most easily rationalized away and most genuinely significant when it is present. It is the quality of the avoidance engagement when indirect communication becomes available. Not direct contact. The avoidant who is sending silent signals is not yet at the threshold of direct contact, or has made the decision that direct contact is not something they will permit themselves, regardless of the interior's orientation. But indirect communication. The shared context, the mutual connection, the environment in which something can be communicated without the full vulnerability cost of direct communication. In those environments, the avoidant who secretly misses you communicates with a specificity that is disproportionate to the casual framing they deploy. They reference things that could only be relevant to you, say things into the shared space that carry meaning available to you specifically, even when presented as general. Engage with content or topics or qualities of conversation that belong in the interior filing system where associations live, to the territory of what you share. Not obviously, not in a way that announces itself as directed at you, but with a consistency and a specificity that, over time, is distinguishable from the random distribution of a person engaging with their environment without particular direction. The indirect communication is the interior reaching toward you through the only channel the management system permits at this stage. The direct channel is closed, too vulnerable, too requiring of the acknowledgement that the interior investment exists. But the indirect channel, plausibly deniable at every point, available to be framed as general rather than directed, that channel is available. And the interior, which has been generating the impulse toward contact that the management system keeps from reaching the direct channel, finds this one and uses it. What it communicates through this channel is not always legible as a specific message. It communicates more in the register of presence, of continued orientation, of an interior that has not completed the processing it would need to complete in order to be genuinely indifferent to whether you receive the communication. The signal is not indifference. It has never been indifference. And the indirect communication, however carefully maintained in its casual and plausibly general framing, is the evidence. These three signals, read together and read honestly, describe a specific interior state in the avoidant. They describe someone whose conscious, managed, exterior presentation of having moved on is not the complete account of what is happening. They describe the gap between the presented and the actual, the specific, persistent, behaviorally legible gap that avoidant psychology always produces and that the empath's perceptual capacity has always been able to read. What they do not describe is readiness. Change. The presence of the specific, sustained, demonstrated behavioral shift that would make the interior state relevant to anything practical in the empath's life. The signals confirm the interior orientation. They say nothing about whether the interior orientation will ever produce the exterior expression that would make it something to act on. This distinction is not a caveat added to manage expectation. It is the genuine, honest, most important piece of information available in the reading of the signals. Because the signals are real, and the gap they confirm is real, and the interior orientation they describe is real, and none of that changes the fundamental question of what the empath's own life requires. What the empath needs is not confirmation that the interior orientation exists. She perceived that throughout the dynamic, accurately and consistently, while the exterior was performing a version of things that contradicted the perception. She does not need the signals to tell her what she already knows. What she needs, what she has always needed, what the entire arc of this examination has been building toward, is the behavioral evidence that the interior orientation has found sufficient expression in the exterior world to constitute something she can actually live inside of. The signals are not that evidence. They are the evidence of the gap, the ongoing, persistent, behaviorally legible gap between what the avoidant feels and what they are demonstrating. She knows the gap. She has always known the gap. What she also knows, now, with the specific clarity of everything she has built in the silence, is that the gap is not her problem to close. It was never her problem to close. And the signals, however real, however accurately read, however genuinely indicative of the interior orientation that was always present beneath the managed exterior, are simply information. Not instruction, not invitation, not the thing that determines what she does next. What she does next is entirely, and has always been entirely, determined by something else, by what she knows, by what she requires, by the life she is building that has no vacancy for someone whose interior claims her while their exterior withholds her, by the simple, non-negotiable, hard-won truth of a woman who has done the real work and knows the difference between being wanted in someone's mind and being chosen in someone's life. She requires the choosing, nothing less. And she will wait, not for him, for someone capable of it. She will wait for someone capable of it. That sentence deserves to be held rather than passed through, because it contains something important that is worth examining with honesty rather than simply with momentum. The waiting it describes is not passive, is not the waiting of someone who is suspended in the interval between one significant person and whatever comes next, holding themselves in a kind of relational stasis until the right circumstances arrive. It is the active, daily, genuinely inhabited waiting of someone who is fully present in her own life, building, engaging, growing, discovering, while also being clear about what she will and will not bring her full self to. The clarity about what she requires is not hardness. This distinction matters because the self-protective reading of everything this arc has covered, the reading that converts genuine discernment into defensive closure, is one of the more subtle and more costly misapplications of what genuine healing actually produces. She is not closed, she is precise. Those are different orientations that produce different lives and different futures. Closed is organized around preventing harm. It keeps not only the wrong connections out, but also the right ones, because the filter is set to reject the category rather than to read the specific evidence of what is actually in front of her. Closed is the wound-making policy. It feels like wisdom because it produces the absence of the specific pain that the avoidant dynamic generated, but it produces that absence by producing the absence of genuine risk altogether, which is also the absence of genuine connection. Precise is organized around accurate reading. It is the discernment that this entire experience has been calibrating, the instrument that can distinguish between someone who is genuinely present and someone who is performing presence, while keeping the interior at a safe remove. Between someone who moves toward the real version of her and someone who finds the real version activating in a way that eventually produces retreat. Between the connection that is sustainable because it is genuinely mutual and the connection that is intense because it is fundamentally asymmetrical. Precise does not prevent connection, it directs it toward what is actually workable, actually reciprocal, actually capable of receiving what she brings, without the management response that the avoidant dynamic systematically produced. What is actually workable deserves more examination than it typically receives in conversations about healing from the avoidant dynamic. Because the template for workable has been, throughout the empath's relational history that led to this particular experience, somewhat distorted, not permanently, not irreversibly, but in ways that require conscious examination rather than simply being allowed to persist as the unexamined default. The distortion is this: intensity became the primary signal of significance. The avoidant dynamic is intense, not warm, not reliably nourishing, not sustainably reciprocal, but genuinely, undeniably, in ways that engage the deepest registers of feeling and attention and investment, intense. The uncertainty, the intermittent reward, the specific consuming quality of a connection where so much remains unresolved and the resolution is always just out of reach. These features of the dynamic are painful. They are also activating in ways that the nervous system, over time, begins to associate with depth and significance and the kind of love that matters. This association is the distortion. Intensity is not depth. Activation is not connection. The consuming quality of the avoidant dynamic is not evidence of its significance in any functional sense. It is evidence of its specific psychological mechanism, which is organized around the specific neurological response to intermittent reinforcement. The intensity was real. The consuming quality was real. What it was not was evidence that genuine, sustainable, deeply nourishing love necessarily feels like that. It does not feel like that. This is perhaps the most important practical thing that the entire examination of avoidant psychology has been building toward. Genuine, sustainable, deeply nourishing love, the kind that receives the empath's full depth without retreating from it, the kind that offers consistent, warm, genuinely present reciprocity rather than the managed proximity of the avoidant dynamic, does not feel like the avoidant dynamic felt. It does not produce the same activation, does not generate the same consuming preoccupation, does not have the specific adrenaline-adjacent quality of never quite knowing whether the warmth will hold. It feels different, quieter in some registers, more present in others, less immediately compelling in the way that intermittent reinforcement compels, and more genuinely nourishing in the way that consistent, available, truly received connection nourishes. And the empath who has calibrated her sense of what significant love feels like on the avoidant dynamic will need to consciously, deliberately, with patient self-compassion, update that calibration. Because if she does not, the quieter quality of genuine reciprocity will read as insufficient, will read as the absence of the depth she knows she needs, will read as a reason to move on in search of the intensity that the nervous system has learned to associate with love that matters. The update is not complicated to describe and is not simple to do. It requires the empath to notice in real time when the nervous system is reading quietness as shallowness, when it is interpreting the absence of the avoidant dynamic's specific activation as the absence of genuine connection rather than as the presence of something categorically different. When it is reaching, automatically and without conscious direction, toward the familiar texture of intensity and uncertainty, because that texture is what it learned to recognize as the signal that something significant is happening. When the noticing happens, the practice is not to override the nervous system's reading. Override tends to produce the managed suppression of the response, rather than the genuine update of the system that produced it. The practice is to stay with both things simultaneously, the nervous system's response and the accurate reading of what is actually in front of her, and to let the accurate reading gradually, through accumulated experience, begin to reshape what the nervous system registers as significant. This takes time. It takes the specific, irreplaceable time of lived experience in relational contexts that are genuinely different from the avoidant dynamic. The time of being in proximity to someone whose presence is consistent rather than intermittent, whose warmth does not require earning, whose movement toward genuine closeness does not trigger the retreat that makes the pursuit of closeness feel like the central, consuming activity of the relationship. The time of discovering, in the body rather than in the intellect, that consistent availability is not boring, that reliability is not the absence of depth, that a person who shows up is not less interesting than a person who disappears. That discovery is one of the more quietly radical things that genuine healing from the avoidant dynamic makes possible. Because the empath who makes it, who discovers in actual lived embodied experience that genuine reciprocity is not the diminished version of what she had, but the real version of what she was reaching for all along. That empath has updated something fundamental in how she moves through the world. She no longer confuses the wound for the connection. She no longer mistakes the specific pain of the avoidant dynamic's particular mechanism for the depth that makes love meaningful. She knows, in the body, the difference between being reached by someone and being activated by the specific neurological mechanism of intermittent reinforcement. And that knowing, not as a concept, but as a felt, reliable, available in real-time sense, is what protects her. Not from risk. From the specific, identifiable pattern of the avoidant dynamic risk that would, without the update, present itself in a new context and be received with the same openness that produced this experience. The three silent signals that this piece began by examining are, in the full context of everything that follows from them, real information in a specific and limited sense. They confirm the interior orientation. They describe the gap between what the avoidant feels and what they demonstrate. They read accurately, from the empath's extraordinary perceptual position, as evidence that the investment was genuine and the missing is real. They do not, in any of that, constitute sufficient reason for the empath to restructure her life around their presence. And this is the piece worth returning to with full honesty, because the appeal of the signals is real, and the longing they activate is real, and the temptation to read them as the beginning of something rather than as the ongoing evidence of the same gap is significant and understandable, and requires the full, conscious, clear-eyed weight of everything she has built to navigate, without being pulled back into the orbit of a dynamic that has already produced its complete educational offering. The signals are the same gap, expressed differently, in the quiet, indirect, deniable form that no contact generates, rather than the explicit, direct form that the dynamic itself generated. The thread maintained with no practical purpose. The behavioral inconsistency when something adjacent to her surfaces. The indirect communication that reaches toward her through the only channel the management system permits. All of these are the interior orientation looking for an exit that the architecture will permit. And the architecture, even under the pressure of genuine missing, has not yet produced the one exit that would constitute sufficient evidence. The direct, vulnerable, acknowledging, I am reaching because this matters, and I am willing to do what that requires. Reaching that genuine change would make possible. Until that exit is produced, until the interior orientation finds its way, through the genuine and sustained work that the avoidant psychology makes the most demanding thing available to them, to the consistent behavioral expression that the empath's life actually requires, the signals are simply the gap describing itself. She has seen the gap. She has lived inside the gap. She has done the work of extricating herself from the specific and costly position of being the person who tried to close a gap that was not hers to close. She knows the gap. She does not need the signals to tell her it is still there. What she needs, and this is worth saying one final time, with full clarity and full commitment to the honest rather than the comfortable version, what she needs has not changed throughout the arc of this entire examination. It has only become more precisely known, more clearly named, more non-negotiably hers to require without apology. She needs someone who is actually, demonstrably, in the behavioral world where her life happens, present. Not present in the interior while absent in the exterior. Not present in the silent signals while absent in the direct, vulnerable, I am choosing you specifically claiming that genuine relationship requires. Not present in the gap while absent from the closing of it. Present, fully. In the way that she has been present, with her whole self, her complete attention, her extraordinary depth of engagement, throughout every connection she has brought herself to. The same quality of presence she has always offered back. The same genuine, non-managed, nothing withheld engagement she has always brought in return. That is not a high standard. It is the minimum. It is simply the reciprocity that genuine connection requires. And she is no longer available to anything that falls short of it, not because she has become demanding, but because she has become honest about what she is worth, about what genuine love actually looks like in behavioral terms, about the difference between someone who occupies significant territory in the interior and someone who shows up, day after day, in the actual, ordinary, unglamorous, genuine reality of a shared life. The silent signals are real. The gap they describe is also real. And she, standing in her own life, fully inhabited, genuinely present, no longer organized around the question of what is happening on the other side of the silence, requires more than the gap, requires more than the signals, requires more than the interior orientation that was always there, but never found its way to the consistent, clear, choosing her in the actual world expression that she deserved from the beginning. Not more than the avoidant is capable of as a human being. More than the avoidant has yet demonstrated they are willing to offer. And until the demonstration changes, until the behavioral evidence shifts from the silent signals of someone who misses her in the interior to the visible, consistent, nothing withheld evidence of someone who is choosing her in the exterior. She has her own life to inhabit. Her own extraordinary, fully hers, deeply worth inhabiting life. And she is, every day that she chooses it over the orbit of the gap, choosing herself, which was always the most important choice available, the one that required the most, and cost the most to learn, and is worth, in the full and honest accounting of what it produces, everything.